So the RX 9070 XT comes out on March 6th, but despite promises from AMD of huge amounts of supply, we expect they are going to sell out in day one, and subsequent resupplies will probably sell out pretty quickly because the market is so massively undersupplied right now by NVIDIA, and there's a lot of hype surrounding the 9070 XT. We're going to go through every single model right now because despite what you might think, some of the models are going to perform better than others. That's right, better than others. And as they pop up, you might want to identify the ones that you want ahead of time so when you do see availability, you can pull the trigger. I put all the info into a handy dandy spreadsheet, which I'll leave linked down in the video description. Once the retail listings go live, I will have retail listings for each and every one of these. In the meantime, I put the specs in as best I can, given all the information from the board partners. Sometimes the board partners publish incorrect specs and they later get fixed. So if you see any inconsistencies or anything incorrect in here, just let me know down in the comments. We'll fix it in real time on the Google Sheet. So you might be looking at the spreadsheet going, Jason, look at all these cards. How am I going to figure this out? It's so much to memorize. Let me give you the cheat sheet. Because with maybe one or two exceptions here, all of these cards follow one of three power specs on them. Let's jump into those power specs. There's number one, the stock spec. That's where it boosts to 2970 megahertz. The game clock set to 2400 megahertz, and the total board power, total graphics power is 304 watts. Then there is an overclocked spec. We'll go through the performance of these in just a moment. The overclock spec, you're gonna boost up to 3060 megahertz. Pretty nice boost, 3% there. The game clock goes up 5%. But the total board power doesn't increase at all. They're able to get this performance without any additional change to the total board power. Then there's a max OC spec, and the boost clock goes up to 4.4% total. The game clock goes up to 7.1% as an increase over the stock, and the total board power goes to 340 watts. So it is a significant increase in power to get that last little bit of performance. Of course, you can manually overclock these as well. We'll talk about that in a second. Let's talk about the performance you can expect. So AMD's numbers, again, these are AMD's numbers taken with a grain of salt, minus 2% versus the 5070 Ti. So basically performs just under the 5070 Ti. Obviously in some games it'll be slightly more, in other games it'll be slightly less, but that's what AMD projected using the stock settings. However, if you go to the max overclock, there's no numbers right now for the kind of medium overclock. The max overclock, it goes from 2% slower to 2% faster than the 5070 Ti. So that's kind of the range in there. And that's how to understand these graphics cards in terms of the highest spec, kind of the more middle spec, and then the base spec. Of course, you can't overclock these cards yourself. I don't know if they're actually binning the 9070 XT like max OC cards with better silicon versions of the 9070 XT, or if it's just a 9070 XT that they're applying that to. I guess we're gonna find out when they get them. RDNA 3 was a really good overclocker. I'm hoping RDNA 4 is as well. But if you just wanna go ahead and buy the card, not have to worry about overclocking, but you want the max performance, then get the 340 watt version. We're gonna go roughly alphabetical by vendor. We're gonna start with ASROCK. They've got three different models here. The top model that has the 340 watt spec on it, so that's the 3100 megahertz boost clock, is the Taichi OC. Normally there's a white version of the Taichi as well. However, right now it looks like just the black version is coming to market. I do expect we'll probably see a white one later on in the life of these cards. Now, a couple things to note about this card. Number one, they're going to use not three 8-pin cables. They're going to use the 12-volt high power cable that you often associate with NVIDIA GPUs. It's not an NVIDIA standard. However, NVIDIA has made it standard on their cards. I don't quite know why ASROCK is going with that direction here, given some of the issues that we've had with it. They probably had this card in design for a while. They will have an adapter to 8-pin, however, so it will be 12-volt high power cable to the three 8-pins if your PSU doesn't have that. A couple of other features about this card. It's a 3-slot card, which isn't bad for a high-end card. 330 millimeters in length, so it's longer, but it's not like super long. Some of the cards in here are really beefy cards. In terms of its outputs, it's got 3 DisplayPort 2.1B, and it's got 1 HDMI 2.1. I will say some of the other cards don't have 3 display ports on them, so if that's a deal breaker for you, maybe consider this card or other cards with the 3 display ports on it. Looks really nice overall. It's got a nice amount of RGB. I will say one thing I really like that ASROCK and some of the other board vendors for AMD are doing is they're adding in an additional cable so you can plug in the ARGB header from the card directly into your motherboard, and you can control it using your motherboard or any other RGB software you want. You don't have to download ASROCK's RGB software. That is super nice. 2 thumbs up there. Not much else to say about it other than most of these come with really nice metal backplates to them. You know, it's just got a lot of nice styling elements to it. However, this will be one of the more expensive cards. Not that we've got pricing data just yet. ASROCK's other 2 cards are variants of the Steel Legend. They are identical in all other aspects other than the aesthetics. So let's go through those and I'll cover what they are in terms of their specs. So the Steel Legend, if you bought AMD graphics cards in the past, you'll remember the Steel Legend is typically an all-white card with 3 ARGB fans and an ARGB on the logo. So we're getting that again here with the Steel Legend 9070 XT, although I will say they've added this little gray kind of element into it. Still looks all white to me. And then for the Steel Legend Dark, looks like they're gonna get rid of the ARGB fans. It's just a darker version of it. I think they used to call this the Challenger, but I think they're getting rid of the Challenger model name out of the top. I'm not really sure. And then the ARGB on the logo only. ARGB on the logo only. You'll still have that cable you can plug into your motherboard for the 3-pin 5-volt ARGB, so you can control it separately. You don't have to download ASRock software on it. The other great thing about these cards, of course, is that they're going to use 2 8-pin power connectors, not the 12-volt high power cable, so 2 thumbs up. In fact, 2x8 is one of the kind of smallest amount of cables out there, so great. The other thing is these cards are relatively compact, only 298 millimeters in length, 2.9 slots in width. And these are base spec cards. So what does that mean? They're going to run at the 304 watt TBP or TGP, which is 2970 megahertz in terms of the boost clock. So this is the base spec that you'll normally get. These will probably be among some of the cheaper cards out there. Maybe not the Steel Legend, but the Dark possibly will probably be one of the cheaper cards out there. Let's jump into the ASUS RX 9070 XT offerings. They have 2 models. One is the Prime OC. We'll go through that in just a second. But the other one is super exciting. Of course, everyone's really excited about it, which is the ASUS TUF Gaming RX 9070 XT OC. Now, both of these are OC models. We don't yet know what the clock specs are on them. Are they going to go full 3100 megahertz at 340 watts, or are they going to do the more middle spec? Don't quite know from ASUS. Check the spreadsheet link down in the video description for more on that. As soon as I get that information or they post that information, I will update it. Couple things about these cards, actually on both of them. They're both going to use the new kind of phase change GPU thermal pads on them. I don't know if how new they are, but they use that in place of thermal paste. And often it can shave a couple degrees of thermals off. So that's really, really nice. These are going to, at least the ASUS TUF one is going to be a big honking cooler. We'll get to the Prime OC, which is more of a kind of small form factor build. In terms of their rear outputs for display, they both have 3 DisplayPort 2.1 and they've got 1 HDMI 2.1. Coming down the rest of the card, in terms of the power adapters, no 12-volt high power adapters here, 2 thumbs up. We're gonna go with 3 8-pins both on this and the Prime OC card. In terms of RGB for this card, it's really just this little logo right here. It's really kind of understated, and then there's like a couple of lines right here. And of course you can change that to any color there. You can always turn RGB off. If you're like, I don't want any RGB, you can always turn it off. Don't worry about that. Let's talk about the physical dimensions, because this is a pretty big card. So this is 330 millimeters in length and it's 3.125 slots in width. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean that this is any larger, but the card itself, total width of the card goes all the way to the front of the shroud here. So you'll still be fine. You'll still use that rough, kind of 2 to 3 slot area in the back of your PC build, but you're going to need to make sure you have enough clearance for the front of the card as well, because it is a pretty thick card to it. Other than that, the card looks really, really amazing. It's got a great backplate on it. This is probably going to be one of the more popular and probably one of the more expensive models. All right, let's jump over to the ASUS Prime RX 9070 XT OC. What's different about this card? Really one thing. It is a much more compact GPU out there. So it's only 2.5 slots in width. Only 2.5 slots in width. And it's only 312 millimeters long. It's not the shortest card out there, but it's not like super long like some of them out there. And you're still getting, pretty good cooling out of it. No RGB on this card. They both use the phase change GPU thermal pad out there. It's like the PTM 7950 for those of you GPU enthusiasts out there. It's a little bit better than thermal paste in terms of the thermals out there. So 2 thumbs up there if you want a card that's a little bit cooler. It's a great looking card. I'm super excited to play around with it here in a build coming up soon. I do expect it probably will be one of the more reasonable price, maybe not the cheapest, but one of the more reasonable 9070 XTs out there. Let's quickly go through Acer's offering. Unfortunately, Acer is really kind of late in terms of getting information out there, and they don't have their full specs out just yet. So I'm going to go over this. I'll update that spreadsheet down, linked in the video description, as soon as I get more information. The good thing about the Acer cards is they tend to be some of the cheaper ones out there. Maybe that'll change this generation, but in the previous generations, they have tended to be the more affordable cards, especially the Nitro versions. There are two versions. There's the Bifrost and the Nitro, just like with previous generations. Those are their two lineups. And then each one of those has an overclocked version as well. Those overclocked versions, both the Nitro and the Predator, are going to be the full 3100 megahertz at 340 watts of power out there. So they're going to be the big honkin' overclocks on them. And these are going to use 3 8-pin power connectors for all the cards, overclocked or not. Again, there's not a lot else to say about these GPUs right now, given how it's just all marketing stuff. This is all renders of the GPUs. They're not even really good shots of the card itself. It looks like a little bit of RGB on the logo. I think they're just showing you like air for the fan on it. Nice looking backplate on it with the flow through area. Otherwise, not much else to say. I will say in the past, the Acer Nitro cards have tended to be like the 2.5 slot, more compact GPUs out there. Although it looks like they're going with a slightly different design, or a very different design than they did for last generation, where the Nitro cards were super, super compact on them. Not much else to say right now. Acer does tend to price these pretty aggressively. So check the links down in the video description, and we'll see what they come in with. Let's jump into POWERCOLOR's RX 9070 XT offerings. They're going to have 4 different cards. We're going to have the Red Devil, and then also a limited edition of the Red Devil, which just comes with some extra stuff. We're going to have the Hellhound Spectral, which is an all-white card, and then they're going to have the Reaper, which is a small form factor card, and that's a brand new offering for this generation. Let's jump into the Red Devil. This is typically their highest end card, big honking cooler on it. And this generation, it's gonna be kind of highlighted by this massive ruby kind of light at the end here. I think they're going for, like, again, a dragon kind of ruby looking thing. I saw this at CES 2025 without the lights. It didn't look that impressive, but here in this image, it does look pretty cool. It looks really, really cool. Let's jump through the specifications for this, because this is actually not a max OC unit. This is kind of, I keep calling it the middle OC. I know it is pretty close to the max OC without using any additional power here. This is going to go with the 3060 megahertz on the boost clock, 2520 on the game clock. Again, you're going to get most of the performance out of this, and you can always, of course, choose to manually overclock it or up the power spec as well. In terms of the outputs on it, we're going to go with 3 DisplayPort 2.1 and 1 HDMI 2.1. The card looks pretty cool. It's got a little bit of RGB here. It's got the RGB on the side. But otherwise, it's a nice looking black and red card. A little bit RGB looks like on the back plate as well. In terms of the power connectors, it's going to be 3 8-pins. 3 8-pins, 2 thumbs up there, 12 volt high power here. And then we're going to go, like I said, 3 DisplayPort outs and 1 HDMI. In terms of the dimensions of this card, it's not a small card. It's 340 millimeters in length, and it has a 3-slot spec. So it's not the biggest of the cards. It's kind of more in the slightly chonkier, not the super chonky to them. These cards typically perform really well, especially when manually overclocked, so maybe this is the one for you. Let's jump through the POWERCOLOR Hellhound RX 9070 XT and POWERCOLOR Hellhound Spectral 9070 XTs, because they're basically the same card. They're just different colors, right? One is black like this, and then you've got the Spectral, which is the all-white GPU. Couple of changes from the previous generation. No RGB on the fans. We'll talk more about the RGB in a second. It's LEDs. It's just this kind of front, like, I'm just calling this a headlight because I'm not sure what it is. Similar to the Red Devil, right, where it had the ruby. This has this kind of like light in the front. It's a white LED on the white one, and it's a blue LED on the regular Hellhound model. And of course, the wolf's eye lights up as well with the LED on it. It's not ARGB, it's not controllable. In terms of the overall specs for these cards use kind of a custom spec from POWERCOLOR. So they're going just below the middle overclock and just above the base spec of the card, of the stock specifications, I should say. So they're going to run this at 3010 megahertz, not 3060, 3010 megahertz on the boost clock, and 2460 megahertz on the game clock. So more mild overclock than the middle OC we were talking about. Again, this is a kind of a thing that POWERCOLOR is doing on its own. It's not one of the cookie cutter 3 specs we were talking about. So it should have slightly more performance than the stock model out there. Let's talk about the rest of the specs on it in terms of the card itself. It's got two 8 pins, not 3. That's nice, especially for those of you who have maybe older PSUs, you're upgrading a build, you don't have 3, and you're like, which card do I get? Well, this might be one to take a look at. And then in terms of the display outputs, we've got 3 DisplayPort 2.1, 1 HDMI 2.1 on it. Card looks really nice. In terms of overall dimensions of the card, this is going to be a 2.5 slot card, so 2 thumbs up there, and it's going to be 327 millimeters in length. So this is kind of one of the more reasonably sized cards. It's not one of the small form factor cards, but one of the more reasonably sized, especially OC cards out there. And then in terms of price, typically the white one costs a little bit more because white cards just get charged more for. That's the way it works. And then the Hellhound itself is usually considered a slightly more premium model, but not on par with the Red Devil. So it'll be more expensive probably than the base models that we're just about to check out, but hopefully not much more. Let's jump into a card I think those of you wanting to do a small form factor or compact builder are absolutely gonna love, because it's the most compact of all of the 9070 XTs out there, and that is the POWERCOLOR Reaper. Now, this replaces the Fighter. Remember, the POWERCOLOR Fighter used to be kind of their bottom spec card that they would sell out there. Now they're basically rebranding it as the Reaper, but one of the things they're doing with it is they're making it super small form factor. In fact, it is almost the shortest card, only loses that by 1 millimeter, which you'd never notice. And then in terms of its width, it's a 2-slot card, a true 2-slot card. Totally crazy, but let's go through the specs on it. This is going to be just running at stock speed. So this is going to be a 2970 megahertz on the boost and then 2400 megahertz on the game clock at that 304 watt TGP. Similar to the other cards, it's going to have 3 DisplayPort 2.1 out and 1 HDMI 2.1. Now, one thing I forgot to mention in all the other previous POWERCOLOR cards, I'm just going to drop it here. They are all going to use the PTM 7950 thermal interface instead of thermal paste. So that's a little bit better on thermals for a lot of things. We talked about that in some of the previous models. That's going to be on all of POWERCOLOR's 9070 XTs. Let's take a look at the card itself. You can see it's basically the no frills version, but again, especially if you're putting this in a small form factor build, there's no glass anyway, who cares? And I think the card does look nice, even without RGB or anything like that. And again, it's a 2-slot card, which is 2 thumbs up. It's going to have 2 8-pin power connectors. Not real good shots at the top of the card. This is the best I could get. It's right here. You can see the 2 8-pin power connectors. And then the back plate, kind of just very basic stuff on it. In terms of the slot width, again, 2 slots and then 289 millimeters in length. The only shorter card out there is the Gaming OC at 288. You're not going to notice a 1 millimeter difference, so I would call this one the most compact of all the 9070 XTs out there. Hopefully it also sells for that base price. Let's jump into XFX's RX 9070 XTs, because they've lost their minds, absolutely lost their minds. They've introduced 11 different models just to the 9070 XT. Forget the 9070s. We're not even doing 9070s right now because this video would be 3 hours long. But basically, let me help you break this down. We're not going to go through every single card because that would just be insane. They have 3 different classes of card. They've got the Mercury, they've got the Quicksilver, and they've got the Swift cards, right? Mercury, Quicksilver, and Swift. Mercury's at the top, Quicksilver's in the middle, Swift is towards the bottom. I will say in terms of the differences between the cards, starting with the Mercury cards, it's basically that both the Mercury and the Quicksilver have versions where they have used their magnetic fans here. You can just pull them out. They actually use magnets. Super cool, by the way. If you ever have a bad fan, super easy to replace, super easy possibly even just to repair it there. I love these, but if you don't want them, you are going to pay a little bit more for them. So just know that. So if we look at their different models here, starting at the top, the XFX Mercury models, except all the OC ones, all have the same spec, which is the top spec, 340 watt TGP, 3100 megahertz on the boost clock, 2570 on the game clock. So if you're looking for cards with that max overclock spec, the XFX Mercury OC ones are the ones you want to grab. There also is a Mercury non-OC one. I don't know why. It just kind of complicates things. They all have this ARGB strip on the top. Looks super cool. And I will say these cards are super chunky, huge. They are 360 millimeters in length. I think those are the longest cards. And they are 3.5 slots in total width. So these are going to go in big builds. These are not small form factor cards for any of the Mercury cards. The Quicksilver get a little smaller, and then the Swift cards get a little smaller still, but they're still not small cards. In terms of power, they're going to use three 8-pins here at the top. That's pretty much all you really need to know about these. They are using vapor chambers for the Mercury cards in terms of the cooling, which is 2 thumbs up. A really, really nice way to cool the card. And I expect these cards to be among the more expensive ones. They do have one other Mercury card here. So they've got the Mercury Magnetic Air OC, the Mercury OC, and then they've got this Mercury Radeon RX 9070 XT, so the non-XT. And it's just got a white LED bar on the top, and it runs at the base spec with the base power spec. So really that's the only difference for that one. So if you see that and it doesn't say OC on it, just know it's gonna run at the base spec. All right, then we have their Quicksilver cards next for XFX. Now these are gonna come in basically 2 different flavors, either in white and black, and then either with the magnetic air fans or without them. That's why there's 4 different models. These are the ones with magnetic air fans in white and black, and these are the ones without the magnetic air fans in white and black. Again, I'm not certain that all of these are going to come necessarily to your market. So just know that these are all going to be using these stock specifications for the 9070 XT, which is a 304 watt TGP, 2970 megahertz on the boost clock, and 2400 megahertz on the game clock. So again, that's stock spec. Now, I will say they also lose the vapor chamber. This is going to use a standard cold plate in terms of the cooling for it. Maybe that matters to you, maybe it doesn't. So you're not maybe going to be able to push these as hard as the other ones if you want to manually overclock them. In terms of the looks of them, there's just the white logo here. That's an LED logo on both the black and the white cards. They're also going to offer customizable shrouds in the near future where you can add these highlights to them. They're magnetic apparently. It just says details coming soon. Let's get into the specifications. 3 DisplayPort, 1 HDMI, 3 8-pin power connectors, similar to the Mercury ones. And then of course we've got the 3.5 slot width on them and 350 millimeters in length. XFX is known for their longer cards. So these 350 millimeters, 10 millimeters shorter than the Mercury ones, but still among the longer cards out there. Probably going to be more in the mid-range in terms of price. That brings us to the Swift cards. These are going to be the cheapest models. They're all going to be 3-fan, the 2 of them. There's going to be a white one and a black one. But just know that we have seen a model that's going to be introduced in China that only has 2 fans on it. I don't know if that model will eventually make its way to the US if you're looking for a 2-fan model. This is a 3-fan model. These are going to be the cheaper ones. I do want to make one note. I'm looking through these specs, and I think XFX may have mislisted some of these, because while they say 3.5 slots here for this card and some of the other cards, if you look at the actual product dimensions, the card dimensions, they listed as 65 millimeters. That's what 6.5 centimeters is, 65 millimeters, which is technically 3.25 slots because a slot is a hair over 20 millimeters. So I'm a little iffy on the dimensions here, what's actually correct. So these do appear to be a little bit narrower, but they are all base spec cards, 2970 megahertz on the boost clock, 2400 on the game clock, 304 watts TGP. The only RGB, or not even RGB, there's no RGB on it. The only LED is the white logo up here at the top of the card. They're pretty basic in terms of the cards themselves, in terms of the shroud and everything. They're kind of the no thrills, no frills one, but they are listed at being 325 millimeters in length, so they are also quite a bit shorter. In terms of pricing, I would expect these to be among the cheaper cards out there. Let's jump into Sapphire's 3 RX 9070 XT models. One of them may be kind of controversial, and that's the Nitro Plus. This is the one that most people are usually excited for. This is oftentimes the most expensive card of its class, of its models out there. And the 9070 XT, this is not going to disappoint. But let's just start off maybe with the controversial stuff. They're going to use a 12-volt high power connector, and it's going to basically plug into the back of the card. You're going to remove this magnetic back plate here, and they're going to plug it in like this. And look at the bend on that cable. I just have to tell you, maybe they've already engineered this in such a way that there's enough distance there that that's fine for the bend on it. I just know with as many problems as these cables have had, I feel a little uncomfortable. I would want to see a review of this and use it myself before that. The other cable here is the ARGB cable. That's perfectly fine to bend. That just goes to your motherboard, so you can control the ARGB on the card. Let's go through the rest of the specs on the GPU. Again, it's a nice honking GPU here. It's got this really cool grill at the top. I absolutely love this grill with the light bar. The previous generation, like 7000, just had the light bar at the top. This has the whole grill to it. Again, here's the removable backplate here where the 12-volt high power cable comes in. Let's talk about in terms of the OC spec, this is going to be I keep calling it the middle OC spec. I know it's pretty close to the full TGP one. So this is going to be the 304 watt, 3060 megahertz on the boost clock and 2520 megahertz on the game clock. So there's going to be that almost all the way up there, but not quite OC spec on it, which is really, really nice. These cards tend to really kill it in terms of cooling. They're also going to include the PTM 7950 thermal material on there instead of thermal paste. You're going to get some reduction of the temps on that. Overall, this looks like an absolutely fantastic card with nice RGB on it. Let's talk about the outputs real quick. 2 DisplayPort and 2 HDMI on there. So 2 DisplayPort, 2 HDMI. In terms of the length of the card, it's not actually that long. It's only 331 millimeters and 3.2 slots in width. So overall, I like the card. It will come with an adapter, by the way, for the 12 volt high power. So you can plug that in and then plug 8-pin in. So you don't need a PSU with a 12 volt high power cable on it. You can use the adapter instead, but it is that angle that I'm a little worried about. Let's jump into this Sapphire Pure. This is often a very sought after all white model out there. And the good news is no 12 volt high power cables on these. It's going to be 2 8-pins instead. So spoiler alert there, 2 8-pins, nothing really to worry about. I will say they come in right here at the top. This is the top of the card. It's upside down. And it also does have that ARGB controller, which is really nice. It comes in right there and you can run it out the bottom of the card. So great for cable management. You will never see it in your build. In terms of the spec for this card, this is going to use that slightly higher than stock one at 3010 megahertz. So this is like a custom overclock, and then 2460 megahertz on the game clock at 304 watts TGP. So it doesn't go up to that middle OC spec that we keep talking about or the max OC spec. It's slightly higher than stock, which is still absolutely fine. Other specifications for this card include it's got 2 DisplayPort out, 2 HDMI out, and in terms of its length, it's actually one of the shorter cards, or shorter-ish cards, 320 millimeters in length and only 3 slots wide. ARGB on it, just a light bar at the top here, which is, I think, pretty tasteful. Remember, you can just do a solid color if you want, just help illuminate your overall build if you want to just turn that completely white or something like that. These tend to be, again, because they're the white cards, there's often a price premium for them. They tend to be one of the more expensive white versions out there, but a lot of people think that they're worth it, especially given that they are using that thermal compound instead of thermal paste on them. Let's jump over the Gigabyte RX 9070 XTs. There are 2 models. They've got the AORUS RX 9070 XT Elite, and they've got the Gigabyte Gaming OC RX 9070 XC. We'll get to that one in just a moment. We'll start with the AORUS Elite. I just have to mention this though. What is going on with your marketing department, Gigabyte? Ready to play high? Like, ready to play high? Like, what are you trying to say here? Anyway, you can make it that what you will. I've already made of it what I will. Let's talk about the card itself. Now, there seems to be some confusion with Gigabyte whether or not they're allowed to publish the specs. I did reach out to them because they have not published the clock specs for these or the power profiles for them. They seem to be under the illusion, or the belief rather, that they're not allowed to publish them yet, even though I told them, hey, everybody else has their stuff out. So I will put them down in the spreadsheet as soon as we get that information out there. The AORUS Elite tends to be usually one of the higher, more premium models out there in terms of clock. So I wouldn't be surprised if this did have the 340 watt TGP on it, or at least the 3060 boost clock OC on it. So the other thing is these tend to be super great in terms of build quality. Tons of ARGB on them. So they've got the fans, they've got the ring lights on the fans, got some ARGB on the front, ARGB logo on the top. And they also have, if I can get to it here, a little bit of ARGB on the back plate right here, ARGB on the back plate. In terms of the cooling, this is probably going to be one of the better models. Both the Gigabyte Gaming OC and the AORUS Elite versions of like 7000 series GPUs tended to be the highest end in terms of being able to push clocks with a manual overclock. They're going to use a vapor chamber on this for the cooling, so 2 thumbs up there. Let's talk about these specifications. In terms of HDMI DisplayPort outs, 2 of each, 2 DisplayPort 2.1, 2 HDMI 2.1 as well. And then in terms of the length of the card, we've got 339 millimeters, so not the longest card out there, but definitely one of the longer cards. And then just under 3 slots in total width. These tend to be priced a little bit more expensive. In fact, they're generally one of the most expensive models out there. Again, a lot of good build quality. If you want to vertically mount a card and you have a lot of ARGB kind of desires, this might be the card for you. I did forget to mention, of course, 3 8-pin power connectors are right there on the back. So 2 thumbs up, no 12 volt high power here. All right, let's take a look at the Gigabyte Gaming OC RX 9070 XT. Again, Gigabyte has not published their clock specs and power profiles for their cards just yet. So when they do publish it, I will list it down in the video description. The Gaming OC card is a card that I am pretty excited about. To me, these cards usually have really great coolers on them, at least in the past generation, and they're offered at relatively good price points. In fact, the 7800 XT Gaming OC turned out to be the best in terms of its overall cooling. You could push that card the hardest in terms of a manual overclock. This card right here, not a lot of changes. A lot of RGB goes away with the AORUS Elite to the Gaming OC. I do like this feature that they're offering, which is you can slide the top part of the shroud so that if you don't want the Gigabyte logo illuminated, you just want that more understated, and you want to instead have just the light bar on the top, you can do that. So 2 thumbs up there. Again, 3 8-pin power connections on the top of the GPU. This is also one of the tightest cards for those of you doing small form factor builds. So this is only 288 millimeters in length. In fact, I believe this is the shortest by 1 millimeter, the shortest RX 9070 XT out there. 2.8 slots in overall width. So those of you looking for a nice, super tight card, really, really good. This also maintains the vapor chamber cooling from the AORUS Elite version, which is great, absolutely great for the overall cooling. In terms of the outputs, 2 display port 2.1, 2 HDMI 2.1. I think generally price-wise, this tends to be one of the better price cards. The 7800 XT was not, just because that was the best overclocker and people gravitated towards it. But generally, the Gigabyte Gaming OC lineup, really, really well priced. Finally, we have Yeston. I'm just gonna cover a little bit on this card. When we get the full specs for them, I will leave them linked down in the spreadsheet that's linked in the video description. 2 cards that were showed off at AMD's Chinese event for the 9070 XT launch. The Sakura Atlantis pictured here, and then we've got the Sakura pictured here. All we know is that in China, they're going to be offered for $100 and $115 respectively over the MSRP. So they're usually a little bit more on the expensive side. They typically are available in the US. It often just takes a little while for them to get here. Remember, this spreadsheet and all the retail links are going to be in the video description. Check that out. We'll be adding to this spreadsheet. If you see anything that we got a little bit wrong here or the specs have changed, that's usually what happened. They published an incorrect spec. Let me know. We'll, of course, get the spreadsheet fixed up as quick as we can. If you got value out of this video, please give it a like. This was actually a ton of work. This will really help to give a like and, of course, subscribe for more cool PC content. And we'll catch you on the next one.